Welcome again to the Human Services Council. HSC is the way that nonprofit human service providers can work together to advocate for the sector and for the clients they serve. This webinar is a project of HSC's Disaster Readiness and Resiliency Initiative, funded in part by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, to ensure both that organizations can help those who need them after disaster and so that they can continue to fulfill their normal functions. HSC helps organizations prepare for emergencies. This webinar continues a multi-part training. I'm Haim Obadia, and I am the presenter for this webinar. Jason Wu and Jennifer Diamond are managing the technology and logistics. First, there was a self-study webinar, which provided an introduction to the group webinar held on April 7th. That live webinar provided an overview of emergency preparedness and especially writing an emergency plan, including the process of setting up a team and the steps to go through in completing a plan. The second self-study webinar focused on two topics: a general introduction to the role of human services organizations after disaster, and the emergency action plan as part of an overall emergency plan. That part of the plan describes what you would do in cases of emergencies like fire, gas leak, bomb threat, etc. The third self-study webinar discussed incident leadership and went into detail about mission essential functions and why they're a crucial component of a continuity of operations plan. Then in the second live webinar, we focused exclusively on one part of your emergency plan, the Continuity of Operations Plan, or COOP. Now, in this last self-study webinar, we'll look at strategies to ensure that your emergency plan remains a living, relevant document. And finally, it'll suggest what you need to do to get to a final goal of having a written emergency plan. If you missed any of the webinars, you can access them online. Now, let's get started. In this session, we'll cover two topics: maintaining the plan and the next steps to take. As we've said before, your emergency plan must be relevant to your organization, practical, and realistic. And once you've created a plan, you need to keep it relevant. We'll talk about three aspects of that: ensuring that everyone in the organization understands the plan and understands their role in it; regular review at least once a year to ensure that the plan remains up to date; opportunities for staff to practice elements of the plan. Your first task is to complete a written plan. That plan should be, one, comprehensive, having everything in one place without major gaps, but also not including every possible thing you can think of. 2, equitable, ensuring fairness and respect for individuals and communities. 3, durable, so that it doesn't need to be changed every 10 minutes, but has sufficient flexibility to incorporate changes. Distributing is to share with all staff and appropriate parts of the plan with relevant stakeholders. Educate is to ensure that everyone in the organization understands the plan and understands their role in it. You must review your plan at least once a year. That'll give you an opportunity to check for changes in staff or titles or job responsibilities, changes in vendors, partners, agency contacts, changes in programs or services or table of organization, and to consider any needed expansion. Your plan is meant to be a living document. It must be practicable. That is, you must be able to put it into operation when necessary. Staff must know how to do that, so training is necessary. The plan must be doable, so exercising is necessary. Let's go into a little more detail about this. Some training and exercises are discussion-based. A seminar is an informal discussion that orients participants to new or updated plans, policies, procedures. This is especially useful in training. A workshop resembles a seminar, but it builds specific products such as a draft plan or policy. Those can be useful, but rarely need to be conducted in training or exercising your plan. A tabletop exercise involves key participants discussing simulated scenarios in an informal setting. This is by far the most common exercise for a nonprofit organization. So I'll talk about it a little more in a bit. A game is a simulation of operations that involves 2 or more teams in a competitive environment, and games are rarely a good use of time for human services organizations. Other exercises are operations-based. A drill is a coordinated, supervised activity usually employed to test a single specific operation or function within a single entity. For example, a fire drill. These are generally easy to plan and execute. A functional exercise involves the coordination, command, and control between various multi-agency coordination centers. And a full-scale exercise is typically a multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional, multi-discipline exercise. There is rarely a need for a nonprofit organization to do a functional or full-scale exercise. When planning a tabletop, start by reviewing your emergency plan. Define your goal for the tabletop. Is it to test how well people understand the plan? Is it to evaluate whether your plan is realistic? Is it to help guide people through what the plan calls for them to do? Create a small team to plan and conduct the exercise. With input from your team, then identify some specific objectives. Create a scenario. There are many samples online, including from Federal Emergency Management Administration the 11 national planning scenarios. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. However, you should tweak the scenario as necessary so that it fits your situation. You'll need to identify facilitators, participants, and observers. Decide on the details. Will you just present a scenario, or present a beginning scenario and then an update to the scenario? Will everyone work together or break into groups, etc.? Once you know the format and you've made those other decisions, you can tweak the scenario if necessary. Who should participate will be influenced by the goals and objectives you've set. Observers are necessary because neither facilitator nor participants have time to document the discussion. An observer also has a different perspective that can be useful. When the tabletop is over, you need to look at what happened and how it happened, whether it met your goals, etc. Debrief is what happens at the end of the exercise, asking participants what the experience was like, what worked well or didn't, what they're going away with. Evaluations are written documents that participants and observers fill out after the exercise. It's often good to give people a day or two to consolidate their thoughts before they write them down. But be sure to follow up and get the evaluations back. The after-action report is critical. It should include an overview of the exercise, who was on the planning team, the goals and objectives, details on how it was conducted, who participated, a summary of the process and outcomes, lessons learned, summary of evaluations, and perhaps most importantly, recommendations for future exercises. At this point, we've talked about all the components of an emergency plan. So it's time for you to ask yourself, are we ready to start writing an emergency plan? Are we prepared to finish writing an emergency plan? What are we willing to do? For the rest of this session, I'm going to provide some guidance on how to move forward in writing a plan. Keep in mind throughout that you'll need to answer these questions for yourself. Let's begin with the factors that contribute to successfully completing an emergency plan. The main players must be motivated. That includes senior management, of course, but there also needs to be buy-in on the part of other gatekeepers. It needs to be clear what the final product will be. What is it that people expect to get from this work? Those involved must acknowledge their responsibilities to the project, and they must be held accountable for them. The people involved must understand that they're responsible to one another for the work they need to do. They need to work as a team. Do not plan more than you can reasonably accomplish. Determine what you can realistically achieve and plan accordingly. In making a decision to write an emergency plan, And in beginning to lay out the project, be sure to make an honest assessment of the organizational environment. Don't set yourself up for failure. In a previous session, we laid out these steps in writing an emergency plan. Let's review them. First, you need a team. Don't expect that any one person can do this alone. You'll then gather relevant information. Drafting the plan is usually the most time-consuming part of the process. Remember to get input from a variety of people in the organization, as well as routing it for management approval. When it's been approved, it's important that you not only distribute the plan throughout the organization, but that you educate staff. It is critical that every staff person understand the plan and understand their role in it. These are the sections that are in the HSC emergency plan template. One critical decision you need to make is whether you can complete all these parts within a single project, or whether you'll need to segment it and focus first on finishing just one section before moving on to another, and if so, in which order to do them. A related decision is whether the plan will be written for the entire organization or whether there are reasons to do more than one plan, each focusing on a part of the organization, whether on the basis of location, regulatory environment, or other factors. So now you could take your to-do list, whether you do it manually or have software for it, and start writing down all the things you're going to do. But let's not. We recommend that you set milestones. Having specific milestones will help you track progress on your plan. It will help you explain the process to others when you need to, and it will help you recognize your accomplishments. What's the difference between milestones and to-dos? Milestones are different from tasks or action items. A task is something to do. For example, cook dinner or lift weights. Those don't tell you what your goal is, and they don't give you a good way to evaluate what you do. A healthy and tasty meal, on the other hand, is a milestone. It's clear on what you want to accomplish, and it gives you parameters for evaluation. If you end up with a meal that's healthy but tastes terrible, you have cooked dinner, but you have not achieved the milestone. Also, it leaves open the details of how you'll accomplish the goal, so it gives you greater flexibility. If you decide to order out instead of cooking, and the food is healthy and tasty, you've achieved your milestone. Lift weights doesn't tell you much, but 16-inch biceps is a milestone that establishes a goal and gives you a way to evaluate your success. None of this means that you won't have to-dos, but the to-dos are not how you measure progress. Let's consider some examples. Here are some tasks that might be needed. How would we identify a milestone to indicate whether or not we achieved what these tasks are meant to accomplish? We may know what the mission essential functions are, but just knowing it doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. What will actually show progress is having a list. We need to meet with management, but the meeting isn't the point. We're having the meeting to get approval. Planning a tabletop is a good thing to do, but you'll know you've achieved something tangible when you've written the after-action report detailing what was learned from the exercise. Here's another list of tasks. Let's identify some milestones that are tangible and specific. These are effective milestones. But keep in mind that you don't need to measure every small step of progress. It may be more efficient to have a larger inclusive milestone rather than many small ones. Defining your milestones may not be easy. These are some milestones that might be included in your action plan. Remember, however, that you are the expert on your organization, so you may need to revise these to better fit your situation. Also, try not to overwhelm yourself. It may be better, once you have a full list, to concentrate on just the part that needs immediate attention. When you know what your milestones will be, you can put together your detailed action plan. You were given a link to an action plan template we prepared, and that might be useful. Do note that there are 2 pages. So this brings us back to the questions I asked you to consider. I realize you may not know the answer now. You might need to confer with others at the organization or just take time to think about it. If you do move forward with writing a plan, I hope the material we've covered will be useful, and I'm glad it'll continue to be available to you online. At this time, though, I want to point out in particular the 3rd question, because even if you don't write an emergency plan, that doesn't mean you can't make progress in being better prepared for emergencies. Early on in these sessions, we offered our recommendations for what you can do to help your organization prepare. We encourage you to do as many of these things as possible, whether you write an emergency plan or you don't. If you have questions about the material, or you'd like more information about the Human Services Council, email info@humanservicescouncil.org. Finally, I don't want you to leave without taking a moment to recognize how much you've learned just by engaging in these webinars. Whatever your next steps are in preparing for emergencies, Human Services Council and I wish you success. Thank you again for joining Human Services Council's training, Emergency Planning for Human Services Providers.